Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the moment when a sudden flood threatens to wash away Tu Tien's garden and Jack's fragile stability, forcing them to face not just financial pressure, but the raw power of nature itself. Can their love and resilience survive when everything seems ready to collapse at once? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning sun slipped quietly through the curtains, pouring a soft golden glow across the small kitchen. Steam rose in gentle spirals from the bamboo steamer where Tu Tien stood, hands moving with calm precision. The scent of mincemeat blended with the subtle earthiness of quail eggs, filling the house with warmth before the day had even begun. Each bun slowly expanded under the heat, round and tender, like quiet promises forming in the early hours of a new year. Footsteps approached from the hallway, unhurried, familiar. Jack appeared at the doorway, hair still tousled from sleep, eyes heavy but instantly softening at the sight before him. "Honey, you made steamed buns?" His voice was low, touched with gratitude that didn't need explanation. Tu Tien glanced up briefly, then lowered their gaze again, pretending to focus on the steamer. "They're almost ready," they replied softly. They sat across from each other at the wooden table. When Jack reached for a bun, the warmth traveled through his fingertips. He broke it open, steam escaped in a small cloud. He took a bite, paused, and his eyes lit up. "So delicious, Tu Tien." The praise was simple, but it settled deep inside Tu Tien's chest. They tried to hide the smile blooming on their face, but the corners of their lips betrayed them. Jack moved his chair closer without hesitation. He wrapped his arms around Tu Tien from behind, resting his chin lightly against their shoulder. "Since you came into my life," he whispered, "I've been so happy." For a moment, time slowed. Sunlight stretched across the floorboards like golden threads, weaving around them. More than 500 days had passed since they began this journey together, days filled with small routines, quiet struggles, and countless shared meals like this one. Jack spoke about work, the sleepless nights, the pressure building toward his ambitions for 2026. Yet, even as he talked about contracts and unfinished plans, his voice softened. "But when I'm here," he said, tightening his embrace slightly, "everything feels steady." Tu Tien didn't respond with grand words. They simply intertwined their fingers with his, holding on with quiet certainty. It was a silent vow, "I will always be here." The buns continued steaming gently on the plate, but the true warmth lived in that embrace. The new year did not begin with fireworks or loud celebrations. It began here in a modest kitchen, with honest love strong enough to face whatever waited beyond the door. As the sun climbed higher, the house filled with crisp early spring air. Jack finished the last bun slowly, smiling between bites. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," he said, running to school with sticky rice in one hand. Tu Tien listened, heart lightened by the contentment in his voice. They talked about the day ahead. Jack planned to stop by his mother's house, bringing some buns for her before heading to the company. Tu Tien intended to harvest vegetables from the garden and sell them at the nearby market. Jack looked up, expression turning gentle. "Just do what makes you happy and stay healthy, okay?" The words were simple, but they brushed away a faint worry flickering in Tu Tien's eyes. He carefully packed 2 portions of buns, one for the office, one for his mother. "Mom loves these," he said quietly. Before leaving, he pulled Tu Tien into a tight embrace. "Thank you for everything." The door closed softly behind him. Tu Tien remained in the kitchen for a moment longer, listening to the fading sound of the engine. Hope filled their chest, but beneath it lingered a small, unspoken concern. On the drive to his mother's house, Jack's thoughts turned heavy. He remembered the years she had worked tirelessly to raise him. And recently, the risky land investment with Mrs. Thu had weighed on her heart. The money, still uncertain, cast a long shadow over her peace. Today, he would comfort her. He would give her money for daily expenses. It wasn't just duty. It was gratitude repayment for a love too vast to measure. Meanwhile, back home, Tu Tien stepped into the garden. Early spring sunlight fell over rows of water, spinach, cabbage, herbs, and tomato vines heavy with promise. They bent low, cutting each stalk carefully, almost tenderly. Miyu followed closely, weaving between their legs before curling up on an old shirt laid across the soil. The garden seemed peaceful, birds calling in the distance, leaves rustling softly. Yet beneath the calm, Tu Tien's thoughts drifted to Jack's mother. The phone number for Mrs. Thu had been unreachable. The uncertainty felt like a stone resting quietly in their chest. They considered asking Jack more about it, but held back. He already carried so much. Still, fear crept in. If the money was gone, how would Jack shoulder the weight? Tu Tien paused beside the tomato vines, fingers brushing over green fruit not yet ripe. Another week or two, and they would turn red. Life here was simple harvest. Sell, cook, wait for Jack's return. And perhaps because it was simple, it felt incredibly precious. They tied neat bundles of vegetables, as if binding small hopes for tomorrow. Before leaving the garden, they looked back once more at the thriving rows. Love, like these plants, needed tending every day. Later, Jack entered his mother's modest home, carrying the warm buns. The aroma filled the room instantly. "You brought Tu Tien's buns?" she asked, eyes brightening. He nodded, pouring her water. They spoke of village festivals, of neighbors, of work. Eventually, she sighed and mentioned Mrs. Thu again. Jack listened quietly. Then he placed an envelope on the table. "Use this for your expenses, Mom. I've arranged everything." She hesitated. "You worry too much." He smiled. "You took care of me all those years. Now, it's my turn." After a long embrace, he left, heart lighter but not entirely free. At the office later, under cold white lights, Jack reviewed documents stacked high. Plans for 2026 filled the pages. He called Vin in. "And about Mrs. Do," he added, voice firm. "Find out more information." That evening, he met Luan. They spoke about new projects, Ninbin, tourism investments in Hagyang Tuyen Kwang. Opportunity always came with risk. "I just want to protect my family," Jack admitted quietly. As streetlights flickered on outside, he thought of Tu Tien at home. The market buzzed the next morning. Tu Tien arranged vegetables neatly on a small mat. Customers praised their freshness. Sales were good. Small bills filled their pocket. On the way home, they stopped at a small gold shop. "Do you have something for a man around 30? They asked shyly. The owner presented a slender gold chain. "This one suits him, 280,000 dong." "So affordable?" Tu Tien blinked in surprise. They bought it without hesitation. It was the first gift they had chosen for Jack on their own. By late afternoon, Jack returned home tired but smiling. Tu Tien handed him a small box. "I have something for you." He opened it slowly. The chain gleamed under the lamp. "You bought this?" he asked softly. "It's real gold," Tu Tien said, voice slightly trembling. "And it was cheap." Jack fastened it around his neck and looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes shimmered. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." He pulled Tu Tien into a tight embrace. After more than 500 days together, this simple gift pierced straight through his heart. They sat side by side, sharing grilled spring rolls, talking about vegetables sold, buns delivered, work completed. Outside, the evening settled quietly. Inside, love, steady and unpretentious, held firm against every uncertainty waiting beyond their door. The rain arrived without warning 3 days later. It began as a faint whisper against the tin roof, a hesitant tapping that neither of them paid attention to at first. Early spring showers were common. The soil welcomed them. The garden thrived because of them. But within an hour, the sky darkened unnaturally, and the gentle tapping transformed into a relentless drumming that shook the house's thin walls. Tu Tien stood at the doorway, watching water gather in shallow streams across the yard. The rows of water spinach bent under the weight of the downpour. Tomato vines trembled violently, their red fruit swaying like fragile ornaments in a storm. Jack stepped beside them, silent. This is heavier than usual, he said, scanning the horizon. The fields beyond their fence blurred into gray sheets of rain. By evening, the village loudspeaker crackled with warnings of potential flooding in low-lying areas. A nearby river had risen faster than expected. Farmers were advised to reinforce storage sheds and move livestock to higher ground. Without hesitation, Jack pulled on his boots. We need to secure the back fence and lift the vegetable crates. Tu Tien nodded and followed him into the rain. Mud clung thickly to their ankles. Water seeped through fabric and chilled their skin. Together, they moved quickly but methodically, stacking wooden boxes onto higher pallets, tying rope around unstable posts, covering the most delicate plants with plastic sheets that flapped wildly in the wind. At one point, a strong gust tore a sheet free, sending it spiraling across the yard. Tu Tien chased it instinctively, slipping before Jack caught their arm. "Careful," he said sharply, more fear than anger in his voice. They froze, rain dripping from their hair into their eyes. For a brief second, both understood the unspoken reality. This was no small storm. By midnight, water had begun pooling near the house foundation. Inside, they changed into dry clothes and sat at the small wooden table, listening to the relentless sound outside. The gold chain rested against Jack's chest, cool from the damp air. He touched it unconsciously, grounding himself. If the river overflows, he calculated aloud, the lower fields will flood first. Our garden might survive if the drainage ditch holds. Tu Tien poured hot tea, hands steady despite the tension. And if it doesn't? Jack paused. His instinct was to analyze, to project outcomes, to build contingency plans. But nature did not negotiate like investors. "Then we replant," he said finally. The answer was simple, absolute. They tried to sleep, but the storm offered no rest. Around 3 in the morning, a neighbor knocked urgently at their door. "The water's rising near the communal road," he warned. "Some families are moving valuables to the school building." Jack grabbed a flashlight immediately. "We'll help." For the next 2 hours, they worked alongside villagers, carrying sacks of rice, lifting motorbikes onto higher platforms, guiding elderly residents through ankle-deep water that reflected distorted flashes of lightning. In crisis, hierarchy dissolved. There were no investors, no project managers, no market vendors, only people protecting what they could. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavily on Jack's shoulders. The rain had weakened slightly, but showed no intention of stopping completely. When they returned home, the yard was partially submerged. The drainage ditch had overflowed. Tu Tien stepped forward slowly, eyes scanning the damage. Several rows of water spinach lay flattened. Half the tomato plants had collapsed under the saturated soil. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Tu Tien waded into the shallow water without hesitation. They lifted a fallen vine carefully, pressing soil back around its base as if comforting a wounded animal. Jack joined them. Cold water soaked through his boots, but he ignored it. Together, they assessed what could be saved. Some plants still stood resiliently upright despite the current. Others were beyond recovery. "It's not everything," Tu Tien observed quietly. "Some are still strong." Jack nodded. "We focus on those." The storm continued intermittently for another day before finally drifting east. When sunlight broke through the clouds, it illuminated a village altered but not destroyed. Mud-coated roads, debris scattered across fields. Yet homes still stood. People emerged cautiously, evaluating losses and offering assistance where needed. Jack spent the afternoon helping his mother clear water from her courtyard. She had lost several stored grain sacks but remained physically unharmed. "You always prepare for business risk," she told him, wringing out a soaked cloth. "But nature reminds us we control very little." He considered that carefully. Financial volatility, market speculation, investment, liquidity, he had frameworks for all of them. But rainfall intensity and river overflow obeyed different systems entirely. Back at home, Tu Tien sorted through damaged vegetables, separating salvageable produce from rot. Their movements were deliberate, almost meditative. We'll have fewer goods for the market this week, they said. I'll cover the gap, Jack replied automatically. Tu Tien shook their head gently. No, the garden will recover. We adjust. There was no resentment in their tone, only resilience. Over the next several days, recovery became routine. They drained excess water, replanted seedlings, reinforced soil beds with fresh compost. Neighbors exchanged seeds freely, understanding that cooperation increased collective survival. One evening, as they rested outside watching the sunset reflect off lingering puddles, Jack spoke quietly. When the investment situation escalated, I thought that was pressure. But this, he gestured toward the fields, this feels different. Tu Tien leaned back on their palms. Money problems are heavy, but they're numbers. This is life. He studied their profile in the fading light. Dirt smudged their cheek, hair tied back carelessly, strength visible in every line of their posture. You never panic, he observed. I do, they admitted, but panic doesn't plant new seeds. The simplicity of that statement struck him harder than any financial principle. A week later, small green shoots began emerging from replanted rows. The damaged tomato vines either revived or were replaced. Water spinach regenerated quickly, as if eager to prove its endurance. Jack found himself spending more time in the garden after work. The physical labor grounded him in a way spreadsheets never could. Each plant offered immediate feedback. Neglect resulted in visible decline. Care produced measurable growth. One afternoon, Vin called again with final confirmation. Mrs. Thu had resumed full repayments under structured supervision. The risk had stabilized significantly. It looks manageable now, Vin reported. Jack ended the call and exhaled slowly. He walked into the garden where Tu Tien knelt, tying thin bamboo supports around new tomato stems. It's resolved, he said. They looked up, sunlight catching in their eyes. Completely? Not perfectly, but stable. Tu Tien smiled faintly. Stable is good. He crouched beside them, pressing soil firmly around a fragile stem. For a moment, he admitted, I thought everything could collapse at once. Investment losses, flood damage, expansion delays. And did it? Tu Tien asked calmly. He glanced around. Green shoots stretched toward the sky. Birds had returned to the fence line. The house stood dry and intact. No, he said. That evening, they prepared a modest meal using the first fully ripened tomatoes after the storm. The flavor was slightly sharper than usual, perhaps from stress, perhaps from imagination. As they ate, Jack reflected on the sequence of events. Financial uncertainty had tested his strategic thinking. The storm had tested his adaptability. Both had revealed the same underlying truth. Stability was not the absence of risk, but the capacity to respond without fracturing. He touched the gold chain again, a small symbol of deliberate love amid chaos. I used to measure success by expansion speed, he confessed. More projects, larger capital flow. And now? Tu Tien asked. Now, I measure it by whether we can endure disruption without losing ourselves. They nodded slowly. Outside, the fields glowed under a clear night sky. Crickets resumed their steady rhythm, as if the storm had been nothing more than an interruption. Jack leaned back in his chair, fatigue replaced by a quieter strength. Next season, he said thoughtfully, we'll build raised beds, improve drainage, prepare better. Tu Tien smiled. Planning is good, but don't forget to live between the plans. He laughed softly. The future still contained uncertainties, market fluctuations, weather extremes, unforeseen complications, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. He no longer viewed protection as controlling every variable. Instead, it meant cultivating resilience in finances, in land, in relationships. Later that night, as they lay in bed, listening to the restored calm, Jack whispered into the darkness, whatever comes next, we face it like this. Tu Tien reached for his hand beneath the blanket. Like this, they agreed. Outside, the soil absorbed the last remnants of moisture. Beneath the surface, roots strengthened invisibly. preparing for growth that no storm could permanently erase. And inside that modest house, steadiness earned through rain, risk, and recovery settled deeply into the spaces between them. After days of financial uncertainty surrounding Mrs. Thu's unstable investment, a sudden early spring storm strikes the village without warning. What begins as steady rain quickly turns into a dangerous flood, threatening Tu Tien's carefully tended vegetable garden and testing Jack's ability to protect his family. As water rises through the yard, they work side by side through the night, reinforcing fences, lifting supplies, and helping neighbors evacuate. By morning, part of the garden lies damaged but not destroyed. While Jack confronts both financial risk and natural disaster, Tu Tien responds with quiet resilience, replanting, rebuilding, and refusing to surrender to panic. In the end, repayments resume and new green shoots emerge from the soil, reminding them that stability is not about avoiding storms, but about enduring them together. Through risk, rain, and recovery, their love becomes stronger and steadier than ever.